The moment my daughter-in-law started laughing at the dinner table, everyone else joined her. To them, it was just a harmless joke about an old man who didn't understand modern business anymore. But what none of them noticed was the worn leather folder resting quietly beside my chair. Inside that folder were a few simple documents. Papers that could legally close her brand new boutique before the week was over. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply watched my own son sit there in silence, while his wife mocked the man who had spent 40 years building the kind of business she thought she understood better. And as the laughter faded and the room settled back into casual conversation, I realized something strange. Sometimes the most powerful moment in a person's life is the moment when they decide not to reveal the truth immediately. Because when the truth finally arrives, it changes everything. Welcome to my YouTube channel Whisper Stories, where silence speaks. My name is Jackson, and I am 68 years old. At 68, a man believes he has already experienced every kind of disrespect life can offer. You imagine that the storms are behind you. You believe the years you spent raising children, sacrificing sleep, dreams, and comfort have earned you at least a little dignity at the family table. But one quiet evening at dinner, my daughter-in-law laughed at me in front of everyone. And in that moment, while she mocked the old man who didn't understand modern business, she had no idea that inside the worn leather folder beside my chair were the very papers that could shut down her boutique by the end of the week. What hurt most wasn't the insult. It was the way my own son sat there and said nothing. The dinner was supposed to be simple. My son Daniel had invited me over for what he called a family night. His wife Melissa had recently opened a fashionable clothing boutique in the city. According to her, it was already becoming the next big thing. The house smelled of roasted chicken and garlic bread when I walked in. Melissa greeted me with a polite smile, the kind people use when they are trying very hard to appear respectful. "Jackson," she said, "good to see you." She never called me Dad. Not once in the 7 years she'd been married to my son. Daniel hugged me quickly, distracted as always, his phone buzzing every few seconds. "Dad, you'll love what Melissa's doing with the boutique," he said. "It's huge." I smiled and nodded. At my age, you learn something important. Not every truth needs to be spoken immediately. Sometimes silence tells you more about people than words ever could. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Melissa talked about fabrics, online marketing, influencers, and luxury branding. Most of the conversation moved too quickly for me to interrupt, but I listened carefully. I've spent 40 years in business. Not fashion, of course. Real estate, property law, contracts, the kind of business where small details determine whether someone succeeds or loses everything. But Melissa didn't see that when she looked at me. All she saw was a quiet old man who preferred black coffee and folded newspapers. Halfway through dinner, she started talking about her boutique's location. "It's perfect," she said proudly. "Prime retail street, foot traffic all day." Daniel grinned. "Dad, you should see it, it's beautiful." I nodded slowly. "I've seen the building," I said. Melissa paused. "You have?" she asked. "Yes," I said calmly. "I used to own it." The table went quiet for a moment. Melissa laughed. "Oh, that's cute," she said. "You mean like years ago?" "It's not that long ago," I replied. Before Daniel married Melissa, I had owned 3 buildings on that street. 2 I sold after retirement. The third one I leased, and that lease was still very much connected to my name. But Melissa didn't know that. She leaned back in her chair and smiled the way people do when they believe they know more than everyone else in the room. "Well," she said lightly, "business has changed a lot since then." Daniel chuckled nervously. Melissa continued. "You know, Jackson, retail today is about innovation, branding, social media, not, old school paperwork." She waved her hand dismissively. "Contracts and all that boring stuff." The words stung more than I expected. Not because she insulted paperwork, but because she dismissed the decades I had spent building a life that paid for the very education her husband enjoyed. Still, I stayed quiet. Then came the moment that changed everything. Melissa raised her wine glass and said jokingly, "Daniel tells me you used to be really good with property deals back in the day." "Used to be," I said. She smirked. "Wells, you're retired now, right?" A few seconds passed. Then she laughed softly and added, "I mean, no offense, but business today moves a lot faster than it did in the 80s. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But he still said nothing. And that's when Melissa looked directly at me and said the words that finally broke the silence. "Honestly, Jackson, people your age wouldn't last a week in modern business." The room fell still. I could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. I slowly reached down beside my chair and picked up the leather folder I had brought with me. Melissa noticed. "What's that?" she asked with a playful smile. "Something interesting," I replied. I placed the folder gently on the table and opened it. Inside were several neatly organized documents. Contracts, property records, lease agreements. Melissa looked confused. Daniel leaned forward. "Dad, what is that?" I slid the first paper across the table toward Melissa. "You might want to read that," I said calmly. She glanced at the page. Her smile faded. Then she read it again. Slower this time. The document was a copy of the original lease agreement for the building where her boutique operated. At the bottom of the page was the name of the property owner. Mine, Jackson R. Miller. Age 68. Owner and managing partner of Miller Holdings. Melissa's face slowly turned pale. That can't be right," she said quietly. I leaned back in my chair. "It is." Daniel looked stunned. "Dad, I thought you sold that building years ago." "I sold the others," I replied. "But not that one." Melissa flipped through the pages. Each one made her expression tighter. "Wait," she whispered. "This clause." "Yes," I said. Section 8. She looked up at me. "You still control the lease?" "Yes." "And the renewal terms?" "Yes." "And," she hesitated. "The violation clause?" I nodded slowly. The silence in that dining room became heavier than any argument. Melissa placed the papers back on the table with trembling hands. Her boutique, the business she bragged about for months, operated under a lease that allowed the property owner to terminate the agreement if certain conditions were violated. Conditions that included unauthorized renovations, structural changes, and unapproved signage. 3 things Melissa had proudly told everyone she had already done. Daniel looked between us. "Dad, you wouldn't actually shut down her boutique, would you?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I took a sip of water and looked at my son. "You know," I said quietly, "when you were 10 years old, you once told a neighbor that your father was the smartest man you knew." Daniel lowered his eyes. "Things change," I continued softly. "But respect shouldn't." Melissa finally spoke again. Her voice was very different now. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "That's the problem." She swallowed hard. I didn't mean to disrespect you." I folded my hands on the table. Mocking someone in their own family is rarely accidental. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. Melissa stood up. Not angrily. Not defensively. She simply stood there, looking at the table. "I worked really hard for that boutique," she said softly. "I know," I said. She looked up at me. "Are you really going to destroy it, just to prove a point?" I thought about that question carefully. Because power is a strange thing. When you hold it, you discover what kind of person you truly are. Finally, I closed the folder. No, I said. Both Melissa and Daniel looked surprised. No, Daniel repeated. I shook my head. I didn't bring these papers to threaten you. Then why? Melissa asked. I looked at her calmly. To remind you that wisdom doesn't disappear with age. I pushed the documents back into the folder. Your boutique will stay open, I continued. But tomorrow morning, we're going to sit down and review every change you've made to that building. Melissa nodded quickly. Yes, of course. And we'll fix the lease issues properly. Thank you, she whispered. I stood up slowly, grabbing my coat. Before leaving, I looked at both of them. Success has a funny way of making people forget who helped build the road they're walking on. Neither of them spoke. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt something inside me settle. I could have destroyed her boutique. Legally. Easily. But some victories are more valuable when they come with mercy. A week later, Melissa visited my house. She brought coffee. And something else. Respect. Jackson, she said carefully, I'd really like your advice on the boutique. For the first time in 7 years. She called me Dad. Moral of the story. Never mistake age for weakness. The quiet people at the table often hold the most power and the greatest wisdom. And respect given freely will always protect you more than pride ever will.